This week on People Who Think Their Advice is Better Than It Actually Is, we're going to continue looking at the 5 points that Dave Ramsey uses in his video, Advice for Young People Who Want to Get Rich. In part 1, I went through the first 2 points, having a budget on paper and you've got to get out of debt to stay out of debt. In response to that, I suggested replacing those with advice that is more applicable for the average person. 1, create a budget and find a way to follow it that sets you up for success. And 2, avoid debt if possible. Understand all your financial options and take time to think on it. Work to pay off debt, but don't shut down your life. Feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell, or comment below. Please don't be an alpaca in the comments. I will give a general warning as this video will briefly touch on sensitive issues and trauma, so if you're not in a place to hear that, feel free to move on. With the help of Mothra the Bunny of Data Science, we'll continue to the next piece of advice in Dave Ramsey's MLM sermon.
Which brings us back to our starting point, the 9 tenets of constancy.
Damn it!
Quality relationships. What does that mean? To summarize, he means church, but unless you understand the rhetoric he uses, it may not appear that way at first. When he speaks on this point, he combines several different things very quickly in overly generalized terms that, if you're in the audience, you may not catch because he flies through them so fast it doesn't give any time to absorb what's being conveyed. I'll be breaking this down into smaller pieces. He starts out explaining that divorce is more expensive than marriage. Some evangelical denominations highly discourage divorce, in some cases even going so far as to say that divorce should never be an option no matter how bad the situation is. Since Ramsey's program is found in many churches as a way to approach their finances, his program slides perfectly into the church DMs. Finances should be discussed open and honestly before deciding to enter marriage, if that is something you choose. According to Ramsey, married couples should merge their monies together, period. If you look through the videos on his channel, Ramsey will make a point of this and makes it sound like a relationship is bound to fail if they don't pool resources. For some couples, this may be the way to go, but this isn't going to work for everyone. Depending on the source, different financial websites and articles will offer options to consider. I've linked one of the articles that seem to encompass the majority of what I found. While one method of combining finances matches what Ramsey proposes, another option is to combine some finances, such as housing or utilities, but not all. And lastly, there is the option to keep finances completely separate. The main takeaway should be that partners need to have conversations about finances before getting married, especially in environments where divorce is discouraged. I will give him credit and agree that divorce is expensive and it can lead to bankruptcy. Quality relationships means you're able to have the difficult conversations. If he's going to discourage divorce, he needs to be promoting the type of discussions and preparations that should occur before legal marriage enters the picture with the same fervor he has when telling cohabitating couples to get married. So the first piece of advice should be, have open and honest discussions about finances prior to entering a legal partnership. And really, this should go for any legal matter where finances are involved, not just marriage.
The Los Angeles Times states 63% of American families are now considered dysfunctional. That means we're the majority. We're normal. It's the people that had the mom, dad, brother, sister, little white picket fence. Those people are the freaks.
Now let's look at this dysfunction in the family costs you money. I don't necessarily disagree, however he glosses over this, quickly mentioning boundaries, and then just as quickly moves to his next point about addiction. I was the first person in my immediate family to go to therapy, and eventually one of my siblings started to do the same. By going to therapy, I was able to better define boundaries for myself, one of those being financial. According to Barna linked below, 21% of millennials and 16% of Generation X are currently in therapy, whereas only 8% of boomers are. Putting aside the issues associated with paying for therapy, younger generations understand that improving their emotional and mental health will help stop generational trauma. Part of this process includes creating and understanding boundaries. Through this, the excuse of "because family" has started to be viewed through a more critical eye. Fewer people are willing to blindly accept that just because you are related to someone, it doesn't mean that you are obligated to cover up or fix the mistake of a family member, especially if it is detrimental to your health. But Dave doesn't mention therapy as a solution. He implies that there should not be dysfunction, as he calls it, in a family if you want financial success. What he should be encouraging people to do is go to therapy if possible to figure out if you have unhealthy connections to money and finances. During undergrad, one thing that was brought up in my psychology class is that a habit starts for one reason, but usually continues for another. For example, a person may have a bad day at work and splurge on buying a new jacket as a way to cope. If this fits into your budget and doesn't happen on a regular basis, it's not detrimental. The issue is when compulsive spending occurs every time that same person is feeling anxious, worried, depressed, or fearful. In order to resolve this habit, they need to look into why the habit developed and why it continued. Again, this isn't the case for everyone, but to imply that people are poor spenders solely due to a lack of self-control is not the whole story. If there are unresolved issues, this can hamper long-term financial success and impede the overall process to better oneself.
Normal people terrify me because they haven't had enough problems in their life to know how to handle problems when they come up. Something little happens, they just snap.
Let's add another piece. Childhood trauma and your role within the family will affect you in adulthood. When Dave says dysfunction in the family, he is referring to poor choices made by the individual, such as becoming reliant on a chemical or substance, and how the family system is affected by paying for rehab or bailing someone out of jail. He doesn't mention what the root cause may be, but instead implies that it is purely the fault of the individual. He's not really talking about trauma, but trauma can affect the choices we make, and Dave rarely speaks on this. In some of the videos on his channel, he'll suggest that a household should tighten their food budget and live on rice and beans to get by. I grew up poor and food insecurity was a large part of my childhood. Eating beans and rice wasn't a way to save money to reach financial goals. It was a way for our family to get through the month. While Ramsey suggests this type of restrictive eating to reach a financial goal, it's a trigger for me, and I have strong doubts that he has ever had to live on this type of diet for any significant amount of time. For short-term financial goals, this isn't necessarily bad, but this advice is mostly in poor taste, and several households in the U.S. struggle to afford groceries. According to the USDA, roughly 13.5 million people in the U.S. live in food deserts. It's not uncommon for people that have grown up with food insecurity to either hoard food or be unwilling to spend money on food. Both are problematic. Trauma doesn't seem to be a significant factor when it comes to financial success as far as Ramsey is concerned.
You have been weighed.
You have been measured.
And you absolutely
Have been found wanting.
Even though this piece of advice is quality relationships, Dave doesn't discuss that a person should work on their relationship with themselves. While learning to draw a boundary with family members is a good idea, we also need to look at the boundaries that we have with ourselves and how we handle our own situations. By understanding our place in a family system and improving our mental and emotional health, we can create the boundaries we need in order to gain financial success. The takeaway here should be, go to therapy if possible and find a therapist that works for you. Just a reminder that we're still on his third piece of advice. While on this point, Ramsey throws in, quote, people who are addicted to something will end up 100% broke, and the people who stay with them will be 100% broke. This hyperbole opens up questions. If the person we're married to has the addiction, we've combined finances, but we're not supposed to divorce, how are we going to handle that? We don't always know what's going to happen in the future, and even if there were discussions about finances prior to marriage, what happens if they develop a need for pain medication after they get a back injury from work? Even today, West Virginia is still the state that has the most unalived people due to OD. It is a complicated and layered issue that heavily affects those in lower socioeconomic status. While Ramsey explains that you should create a boundary and not let, quote, crazy in, as he calls it, does that mean we're never supposed to help those around us? If we're supposed to be generous, as he mentions in the fifth point, how is excluding these people from our life in line with that point? Are we never supposed to help these people go to therapy or rehab? Isn't the Christian thing to do to help those in need? Compassion and forgiveness are also mentioned in the Bible. Handling addiction is difficult, and by going to a good therapist, we can figure out how to create the boundaries we need to and discuss how to handle this type of situation, which may mean cutting off contact. I have major issues with how people like Dave Ramsey have the assumption they do, as it comes off as unempathetic. In the links below is information on what helps prevent people from relapsing. For example, join a support group, make an emergency contact list, and get help. These involve having connections with people in order to decrease the chance of a relapse. So to reiterate from above, go to therapy if possible and find a therapist that works for you.
Ooh, I eat like a slob, but nobody minds. I'm peeing on the seat. Give me a raise. Now I'm returning to work without washing my hands. But it doesn't matter because I'm Homer Simpson. I don't need to do my work because someone else will do it for me. Do.
But wait, there's still more. Dave Ramsey even manages to slip toxic positivity into this point. Quote, "Guess who gets ahead in this world? Nice people who are generous and love other people. That's who you promote if they work for you. That's who are glad when they get promoted if they work beside you. That's who we want to win." End quote. Where do I even begin? Let's look at who gets promoted. If you do an internet search for who gets promoted, it comes up with a lot of general advice like exude confidence or show initiative. However, we know that is not the case, especially for millennials, Gen Z, and those in marginalized groups. There are many layers as to why certain people are more likely to be promoted, but what I want to focus on in this video is nepotism and if Ramsey even follows his own advice. According to Wikipedia, all 3 of Ramsey's kids work at his company. Even if his kids had to pay for part of a car while in college or contribute to the house in some way, having connections to a good-paying job with benefits is a privilege that many of us in lower socioeconomic levels do not have. While I cannot speak to their particular work ethic, it's certainly difficult to not see this as nepotism from the outside. Although Ramsey has often stated that for his children to inherit his wealth, they have to be of good moral character. That means good moral character as Dave sees it, specific to his own religion and his own opinion. I don't know if his kids would be as successful outside of their parents' company, and I don't know if they are nice people who are generous and love other people. But I find it hard to believe that having Dave Ramsey as their father doesn't impact their place and their income in that company.
I've had to work hard every day of my life, and what do I have to show for it? This briefcase and this haircut. And what do you have to show for your lifetime of sloth and ignorance?
What?
Everything! And do you deserve any of it? No!
What are you saying?
I'm saying you're what's wrong with America.
This idea that only good workers get promoted is a product of a different time, if that even really existed to begin with. Spend 10 minutes on TikTok looking through the hashtag quiet quitting, and there are numerous stories where people explain that they weren't promoted or even recognized at work as they watched another worker receive the promotion. Conversely, there are also stories of people being promoted simply because they knew how to play the game, or they knew how to be the supervisor's favorite, not because they were nice people. The other part of this is Ramsey says, quote, "Out here in the real world, the jerks get punished," end quote. I don't know what reality Dave Ramsey lives in. He was around when Enron happened. He was around when the government chose to bail out Wall Street. These people didn't get punished. We live in the real world and we see how wealthy people can do whatever they want with little to no consequence. Speaking of his company, they are currently in the middle of a court case. In looking through the articles and court documents, Dave doesn't appear to follow his own advice. I'm not an attorney and this is purely my opinions and the research I have found. It is known at his company that employees are required to live by a certain set of principles. While I cannot speak to the legalities of this, there does appear to be a double standard and he seems to have a strong disdain towards women. Melissa Hogan, the wife of a former employee, said, quote, "There seems to be a pattern of Dave Ramsey believing abusive men with power who benefit him. The fact that Dave Ramsey himself and Ramsey Solutions as a company, in spite of evidence and witnesses, covered their eyes and ears, evidences a profound lack of wisdom and discernment," end quote. The Tennessean article further states, quote, "When Chris Hogan admitted details about one of his affairs to company leadership, he said oral S occurred, but not SI. According to the depositions with Ramsey and other company executives, Ramsey and other company executives said in their depositions they don't fire employees for engaging in oral S outside of marriage, but only SI," end quote. I think I speak for many of us that are recovering from growing up in a conservative religious background when I say, this is an egregious case of do as I say, not as I do. I guess when it comes to nice people who are generous and love other people that get promoted, Dave and I have a different understanding of what that means. Puts a different spin on that verse Dave often quotes of, "Evil company corrupts good habits."
He didn't fall? Inconceivable. You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Incredible that we're still on advice 3 because Dave thought we wouldn't pay attention, but I won't dwell on it too much longer. Another reason he gives for encouraging quality relationships is the example that we don't let our kids hang out with juvenile delinquents. The idea is that having bad influences will cause us to make bad financial decisions. Again, this is part of go to therapy if possible and find a therapist that works for you. If there are bad influences in our lives, we should look at why that is. As I've said ad nauseum in this video, by fixing the root of the problem and not just the symptom, we can find a way to reach a better financial situation and are more likely to be successful.
I'm afraid we need to use math.
His fourth point is saving money. Again, not necessarily bad, but he has a very naive and unrealistic understanding of the lives of many people in the United States. But within this point, he sneaks in not just saving money, but investing money. Most banks at this point don't have the same returns on savings accounts like they had in the past. My savings account had a 2.5 yearly interest rate, and some banks are even as low as 0.01%. To put that in perspective, an account that has $1,000 at the end of a year will gain a penny. So expecting money to accrue from a savings account is not something many of us will see. Dave says, quote, "Wise people save money." Again, saving money is not a bad thing, but it's clear, especially in more recent videos on his channel, that he is far removed from the situation that most people in the US live in. The cost of housing alone is eating up more and more of the take-home pay for the average American, but to hear Dave tell it, landlords should raise the rent just because they can. He doesn't understand that the cost of food is rising. He says the quote, "I'm pretty good at making money, I just wasn't always good at keeping it," end quote. This isn't the mindset of those in the younger generation. We're struggling to get basic necessities for the next month, the next week, sometimes the next day. As mentioned in part 1, Gen Z and millennials have the least amount of credit card debt. Our money isn't going to furniture, fancy houses, avocado toast, or country club fees. Another thing from part 1 is when Dave says the 4 to 10 million earned in a lifetime, this doesn't apply to the majority of us. With wages remaining stagnant while the cost of living rises, being able to have a wage that covers our bills is a luxury. Ramsey's advice is for families that earn $200K a year and can't figure out how to pay off $15,000 in credit card debt. It's not going to make those of us at the bottom wealthy. At this point in his video, I started to pick up on how Dave's mannerisms and speech were reminiscent of MLMs and shifty motivational speakers. If you look at the progression of how Dave presents himself in the videos on his channel, he has gradually turned into old man yells at cloud. In earlier videos, as far as 3 years back, his stance mirrors closer to active listening and he's not as loud. Compare that to now and he angrily sits with his arms crossed, half listening to what's being said while calling everything stupid and leaving no room for discussion as he sits in his echo chamber arrogantly speaking about his biblical values. One technique I caught on to is when Dave is quickly running through his points that he uses an assertive tone and will twist the meaning of certain terms. For example, he mentions that his company tells people to save for 3 things. 1, a rainy day, 2, to pay cash for things, and 3, long-term investing. The way he describes a rainy day is what the rest of us would call a major life event or emergency. Using the emergency fund to pay for the car transmission to get fixed is vastly different than saving for a book or video game. Saving up to purchase a game system is saving for a rainy day. Saving money to keep your household out of poverty is an emergency fund. Dave does recommend creating an emergency fund, and I do agree that it's a good piece of advice. A major illness like cancer can turn your life upside down. Using emergency funds for this is using the money as it was intended. Rainy day funds are for fun. Within that same umbrella of a rainy day, he adds unexpected pregnancy because he just doesn't understand what's unexpected about that. Honestly, I can't even talk on that without getting angry, and I don't think it's important for this video. I mention this as evidence of his negative view towards women. When it comes to the second thing, you save up and pay cash for things. In theory, not a bad concept, but if you need a car like most people in America do, you may just have to get a loan. Saving up that much money takes a long time for many of us. Even just getting a down payment for a used car is difficult for many. What's insulting is when Dave says, quote, "This interesting thing happens when you pay for it, you own it." I cannot recall having met a person that didn't understand this. Maybe he didn't seem to understand this when he was younger, but I can't say. He also doesn't understand housing. If we can't save $10,000 for a reliable used car because the cost of living is eating 99% of our paycheck, how are we going to save enough to buy a house in cash? especially in the majority of the US. Ramsey constantly speaks of getting out of debt, but rarely speaks about equity and net worth. If the only debt to your name is a house, a car, and maybe a couple student loans, that's not a horrible place to be. That's how a lot of people lived in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s.
We got 222 and 73. Multiplied by pi. 26 and 261,000. It's cubic. 584 and 214,000. What's the arctangent? 89 and 9/10 degrees. Natural law. 6 and 3,699 10,000. What's the reciprocal? 17 10,000.
Third is you save for long-term investing. When Dave Ramsey was younger, many companies had pensions that employees could retire on. Over time, companies realized they could avoid pensions and sold people on the idea of a 401k. Saving for long-term investing isn't even on the radar if you're just trying to make it day to day. And then he briefly mentions that if you put $100 monthly into a Roth IRA from ages 30 to 70 in a decent growth stock mutual fund, averaging 12%, you can retire a millionaire at $1,176,000. As far as the math, before interest, $100 a month for 40 years is a total of $48,000. I used a Roth IRA calculator and came up with a total of $920,510 when I did it. That's $255,490 less than Dave suggests. Though I suppose near millionaire doesn't sound as good. This is also assuming the inflation rate doesn't balloon and that the marginal tax rate will not change. I also noticed when I looked at multiple Roth IRA calculators, the annual investment return was usually set to 6% and rarely was it set to 12, or anything above 6 really. Since the market has been a bit all over the place, if we recalculate at 6% instead of 12, the balance at age 70 is $185,714. That is a far cry from a millionaire. Are we just going to assume that there isn't another recession around the corner? For millennials, we've already seen 2 in our lifetime. We watched the GameStop fiasco and questioned the validity of the stock market. What is there to make us believe that this is worth our time, or that the annual investment return will be 12%? I have no feelings one way or the other if you want to invest in a Roth IRA, but I advise to be realistic and research multiple sources to find the solution that works for you. It frustrates me when someone is supposed to be a financial expert and then gives out numbers that don't actually match what the reality may be.
Now, calm down, diddly 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 diddly. They did their best, shoddily iddly iddly diddly. Gotta be nice, hostility diddly diddly diddly. Ah, hell, diddly ding dong crap! Can't you morons do anything right?
As you're watching Dave Ramsey's video, you may wonder, when is he going to mention that 5th piece of advice to be rich? He runs through it in less than a minute at the very end. The advice? Quote, people who win with money are always givers. 100% of them are givers, always, end quote. I'll link the video about church and financial literacy here, but if this was the case, then why are the poor the most generous? It's not the rich. Study after study, we see that the people who are most willing to give their time, energy, and money are not the wealthy, it's the poor. It's no wonder he glosses over this in his speech. He says, quote, when you give, you become a generous person. Not just financially generous or mathematically generous, but your spirit changes. You're the person who opens doors. You're the person who carries groceries up to somebody's car, and you're the generous person, end quote. The people at the lowest socioeconomic levels in this country are already generous. I don't open doors for people because I'm rich and learned how to be a generous person. I open the door for other people because they are another fellow human, and I understand that I live within a community of people. You know who doesn't understand that? The wealthy. And yet, in the last 5 seconds, he sneaks in, quote, it's difficult to implement these, but barring a calamity, 100% of the time it works, end quote. It's so fast you might not even catch what he said. These types of claims are also similar to what MLMs will promise. I've linked an article below that discusses possible warning signs. While I am not saying that he is running an MLM, there are some stark similarities, such as outrageous and unfounded product claims. The title of the video is Ways to Get Rich, not Ways to Improve Your Situation or Work to a Comfortable Situation. He claims that 100% of the time, if you follow his advice, you'll be rich. 100% is a pretty specific percentage to use. If that's the case, then every single person that follows these 5 points would be rich, and there would be several testimonies of those that this process worked for them. Then throw in unsettling feeling or cryptic job interview due to those biblical principles and recent court cases, and it's easy to see why one would be leery of his company. Ramsey presents himself in a way that mirrors motivational speakers that yell inflated promises about success into the microphone at their $5,000 seminar, as long as you follow their advice. At surface level, his advice is not 100% bad. The issue is that upon further analysis, his advice comes from a place of privilege and a time that didn't really exist, and certainly doesn't exist now. Until next time.
Well, gang, I hope you had a good time, and I hope you learned some new words, too. Come on back and see me again for some more fun learning. And remember, treat other people the way you want to be treated, okay? I've got to go now. So long!